But then let's talk about your PhD tenure and exactly what you're doing at your PhD, because you have, of course, kindly told us that what it is that you're working with. But how long is a PhD in South Africa?
So I think the minimum is 3 years, depending on which university you go to. But it generally is 3 years long from start to finish. So if you're upgrading from a master's to a PhD, depending on where you've applied for that upgrade, that will also it'll also include the registration of that master's degree as well. Because I mean, technically, you wouldn't graduate with that master's; you'd only graduate with a PhD. So in that way, it will be shorter if that's your intention from the start. You know, going from a bachelor's to a PhD. The other route, which is I think the more typical one, is where you do your master's for 2 years or so. And then you would do the PhD for 3 to 4 years. But I mean, anecdotally, it takes longer than the minimum time. Most people will not finish it in less than 4 years. Whether they're upgrading it from a master's or starting afresh.
Okay, and is there like a maximum time that you need to finish it under?
Not that I'm aware of, but there are other constraints. You know, your interest in the topic, your motivation, as well as the funding that's available for it. I think also, you know, to some extent, there's also the relevance of the research. If it's something that other people are working on, you run the risk of the work being published, and then you lose the novelty. So novelty is something that's it's required in your PhD, the output of your PhD, and unfortunately, if somebody else publishes the same work or something similar, then it's gonna be much more difficult to continue with it.
Of course, yes, of course, because of course, when you're doing a research, it really has to be uncharted territory that you're out there to explore. If someone has already done it before you, then there's no point of you doing the same thing, right? but that's great. But then, if I was to ask you, but how long have you been doing your PhD now?
So I think I registered in 2017 for the first time. That was from my upgrade. So it's been, unfortunately, it's been 6 years. But one of the reasons for that is that I did take up the lectureship position as well. So it technically makes it, you know, doing it part-time. Although it is my priority right now, it is very difficult to do it as a part-time degree. So yeah, I mean that's my journey as well. I hope to finish it by the end of this year. Likely there will be some revisions, or maybe not, and then graduation will be next year. So that's my current aim. And if it all goes well, I mean, I don't see any stumbling blocks along the way this time. Amazing. I'll be a doctor by next year. So I mean that's the approach though. So generally, if you focus on your PhD, that's the only thing you're working on. It will take you about 4 to 6 years, depending on what the topic is, what errors you run into, what needs to be redone, and so forth.
Okay, great. But then if I was to ask you, because as a PhD researcher, I mean, you have a lot of balls in the air when you are doing your PhD. You have to handle one task and one from another. There's a great deal of multitasking. So if I was to ask you to describe, how did a typical work week look like for you as a PhD researcher?
Okay, so I mean, it is going to vary depending on the topic as well. But I mean, just like any work week, you would start off generally in the morning. It depends on the rules of your departments and your research group. And if it's lab work or lab-based as well, it's going to depend on what resources are available, the scheduling of those resources as well. So, I mean, if you're doing an analytical project, you're using the HPLC or the GC or things like that, then you're going to need to work around those resources. It's not very often you're assigned your own one. I mean, it is rare, and it does happen sometimes if you're lucky, but that's going to be difficult. So that way, I mean, just like a normal work week, you start in the morning, finish in the afternoon, and you would tend to do your experiments in blocks. So for my topic, when I did do experimental work, there would be a lot of planning before you do the experimental work. So perhaps a week, 2 weeks, just by your desk, sitting with a computer, preparing your experimental plan. And then over the 2 weeks, there would typically be a meeting with your supervisor. Okay, so at least 1 or 2 meetings with your supervisor to approve of this experimental plan. And if your research group does have it, you would have a discussion group, so a broader meeting with more input, and with those who have more experience in the experimental methods to give you more guidance before you get into it. Okay, so once that 1 to 2 weeks or so is done, you would then spend, depending on what experiment you're running, the next longer duration on those experiments. So again, it's going to be a long duration thing. Unfortunately, if you're in the biochemical space, these experiments can run overnight sometimes. So you need to prepare for those sort of incidents. But I mean, in general, you can avoid those most of the time. So again, it would be from like 8 to 5, working in the lab, doing those experiments, and then not necessarily going home, but going and analyzing it and see what changes you need to make for the next day. So that would carry on for about a period of maybe a month, or 2 months, or even up to 3 months, depending on how many runs you're doing and what matrix of experiments you have. If it's simulation based, it's going to be the similar thing. You'll have about 2 weeks or so of preparing your plan of simulations to do, what type of modeling you use, what software you use, what techniques, where you get your data from, and so forth. And again, you meet with your supervisor, go to your discussion groups and get more input. And then instead of the lab, we'll just be running those simulations in those times. I think most research groups as well across university, or rather most departments across universities in South Africa, have a requirement that you need to teach in the undergraduate space. So you typically, schedule time to be a tutor, an assistant lecturer, and those types of things as well. So yeah, I mean, yeah. So the work week is actually quite packed, and if you're disciplined, you get through these things and you work through the problems rather than letting them go on. And the number of problems actually is quite significant because of the nature of the work. You're going into an exploratory space. You don't know what's going to happen. So you need to be aware of these things and have that contingency while you're doing this. Otherwise, it can throw you off.
And I can imagine you had a very packed schedule. But like you said, mentioned yourself, many times you also have to work as a teaching assistant or as a professor while you're doing your PhD. And can you tell us a little bit more about that? When how far do you have to be on your PhD to be eligible to become a lecturer or a professor on the side?
So the rules vary depending on where you are in South Africa. A few years ago, there was a requirement that you have to have a PhD to become a lecturer. Before that, you could do this as a master's, or you could do this with your master's alone and perhaps some industry experience. But more recently, you have to have your PhD or some level of let's say, progress in your PhD to apply to become a lecturer. So, yeah, I mean, this is going to be dependent on where you are in the country and which university you're at. So at UCT currently, it's, dependent on how much of progress you've made in your PhD, perhaps 1 or 2 years, and evidence to show for that. So maybe a publication, a conference proceeding, that sort of work, and to have a plan to show that you're going to finish it and what you need to do to finish it. Yeah, I mean, so those are requirements.
Okay, great, thank you. But a PhD itself is a very technical tenure. You could see a PhD is it's a very specific topic in a very specific degree. So when you're doing it in chemical engineering, it is a given that you will be using a lot of technical skills, a lot of technical topics, core chemical engineering topics. And that is, of course, a given. That is something that you cannot ignore or reject. But having said that, at the same time, there is also a great deal for you to use a lot of soft skills that you don't necessarily get from the engineering part of the degree. If I was to ask you, what are the most important soft skills that you really need to have in order to achieve success at your PhD?
Okay, so I think, not sure if this classifies as a soft skill anymore, but project management, definitely. So in some universities, it's not taught, in some it's formalized, and more recently, our engineering council has prescribed it for all engineering disciplines. So that's something you need to build on as a PhD student.
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes taken for granted that, this is just some simple topic and you'll eventually come into it, but it's more important to hone on those skills and schedule yourself and find out what resources you need before you get in. Very often, and for myself, I found this out much later, so many years down the line, that this is an important thing to work on before you get going, or at least at the very start of when you get going. The other thing is communication skills. I mean, definitely you need to be a good communicator, no matter where you are, whether as a student, a postgrad, or in the workplace. But specifically as a postgraduate student, you're going to need to be able to write down technical reports better than you were doing it in undergrad, or even in the workplace for that matter. And also, you're going to go for conferences, it's very likely. You're going to be presenting to a large group of people at some point, whether it's going to be for your proposal or when you're done with your work and you're presenting it to the department. So that's something you need to focus on as well. And generally, your people skills, it's something important as well, because as I said, it's not often the case you just get the resource, your equipment just for yourself. You need to be able to work with other people and share the space that you're working within. So, I mean, yeah, it's less so if you're doing a simulation or a paper-based project. It's going to be more important if you're sharing some kind of resource with other people.
Yep, fully agreed. You mentioned earlier that if someone was to go into it gets very difficult for someone to go into the industry and then coming back to the post-graduation or PhD, which is, of course, very much understandable. A lot of people are, because some students they are very indecisive for what they want to do. They want to go into academia, they want to go into the industry, and the general talk of the town tends to be that if you go for a PhD route, you risk having you end up taking the risk that you will only be limited to academia and you cannot go to the industry later on. And you mentioned earlier that, of course, that one route of going from the industry to PhD, that tends to be very difficult. What do you think of the other way around? Do you feel that doing a PhD limits you to only academia, or have you seen recent professionals also going into the industry after a PhD?
Yeah, so more and more, at least in South Africa, we are actually seeing that. We're seeing more and more PhD graduates going into the industry. So whether it's as a consultant, a specialist, or sometimes they go on to completely different things as well. And I would say that the skills that you learn as a PhD candidate are extremely transferable. And most people will agree, in industry as well. And more we're seeing those in the C-suite, so your CEOs, CFOs, who have done some postgraduate study, and many of them even going back and doing their PhD. So I would actually say, yeah, it doesn't restrict you. Obviously, I mean, you will see your colleagues after your bachelor's going off making tons of money. And if that's something that you want, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say academia is for you, even if you're just going to do your PhD and go on. But I mean, yeah, you will see that. You can't ignore it. It's not for those people. It is for people who want to further their study, who want to specialize in something, who are going to want that degree at the end of it. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, as far as being restricted to academia, no, that's not the case. Maybe it was a long time ago, but not anymore.
Perfect. Thank you so very much for that. But then if we were to talk about you, because you are also about to finish your PhD very soon now, and you are, of course, currently also doing your lectureship on the side. So what have you planned for your future? Do you wish to continue in academia or become a specialist in one specific topic, or do you see the industry will be the end goal for you?
So I don't think there's any end goal. I mean, just for myself, I enjoyed learning, and once I've learned as much as I can, then it just becomes boring at that point. So right now, I personally want to move out of academia and into industry. So that's the sort of route that I'm aiming for. I won't say that staying in academia and becoming a lecturer or even a researcher is a boring job at all. No, many people will say that you don't get the freedom that you do outside of academia. In academia, you get to steer research that you want, and And although it's difficult, writing those grants and finding the funding to get things done, it is very rewarding. It's one of the most rewarding places to be in. But I mean, personally, I've wanted to be in industry as well. I think I've learned as much as I can about biobutanol, and that, unfortunately, it's not the next big biofuel. But it's not. It doesn't dissuade me. So my specific goal is to go into industry for the short term. If I find, and I think I will find, that there's going to be a space for more research in that, whatever I do, then it's not going to be difficult to come back into academia.
Of course.
But yeah, I mean, for the short term, at least for the next 5 years or so, I want to see what industry is like, where that takes me.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. And if you have not done so already, remember to become a free member at ChemEnggLife. And do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and stay tuned for more upcoming podcasts with chemical engineers. Thank you, and have a great day.